The American intervention in the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1967 represents one of the most significant and controversial applications of military power in the 20th century, characterized primarily by the doctrine of search and destroy. This strategy, championed by General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, was born from the belief that American technological and industrial superiority could systematically grind down the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, VC, through a war of attrition. To understand the mechanics of this period, one must first recognize the fundamental shift that occurred in early 1965. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the escalating instability of the South Vietnamese government, the United States transitioned from an advisory role to direct large-scale combat. The arrival of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade at Da Nang in March 1965 was the opening act of a buildup that would see nearly 500,000 American troops in country within 2 years. The logic of search and destroy was deceptively simple: find the enemy in the remote war zones, fix them in place with superior maneuverability, and destroy them with overwhelming fire support. Success was measured not by the acquisition of territory, but by the body count, a metric that would eventually become the symbol of the strategy's tragic disconnect from political reality. The soul of the search and destroy tactic was the A-1 Iroquois helicopter, affectionately known as the Huey. The advent of air mobility allowed the U.S. Army to bypass the dense jungles and rugged mountains that had protected communist sanctuaries for decades. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, became the vanguard of this new era. By utilizing vertical envelopment, American commanders could insert battalions into landing zones, LZs, deep within enemy-held territory, forcing the elusive NVA and VC into conventional battles. This theory was first put to the ultimate test in November 1965 at the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. In the shadow of the Chu Pong Massif, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, landed at LZX-Ray and was immediately engulfed in a desperate struggle against a numerically superior NVA force. The battle demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of American fire support. When the infantry was pinned down, Broken Arrow calls brought in waves of A-1 Sky Raiders, napalm strikes, and relentless 105mm artillery barrages. While the U.S. claimed a victory based on the high ratio of enemy deaths, the NVA learned a vital lesson: to survive, they had to cling to the belt of the Americans, fighting at such close quarters that U.S. airstrikes and artillery would risk killing their own troops. Between 1966 and 1967, search and destroy operations expanded in scale and violence. Operations like Masher, White Wing, Attleboro, and Cedar Falls saw thousands of troops sweeping through regions like the Iron Triangle and the Central Highlands. The tactical cycle of these missions followed a predictable, yet grueling, pattern. It began with H-Hour, the preparatory bombardment of a landing zone to soften the area. Then came the Eagle Flight, the rapid insertion of infantry via Hueys. Once on the ground, the GIs would push into the jungle in search mode, often walking into pre-arranged ambushes designed by the VC. The destroy phase relied on the Fire Support Base, FSB, a temporary artillery fortification carved out of the jungle that provided a protective umbrella for the patrolling infantry. The relationship between the infantrymen and the artillery was symbiotic. The grunts served as bait to draw the enemy out of hiding, while the cannons provided the lethal blow. This reliance on firepower was total. During this period, the U.S. dropped more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam than was dropped in all of World War II, yet the search part of the equation remained frustratingly elusive. The enemy the Americans faced was a master of asymmetric warfare. The Viet Cong utilized an extensive network of tunnels, most famously at Cu Kai, which allowed them to disappear into the earth as soon as a search and destroy sweep began. American tunnel rats, specialized soldiers equipped only with a flashlight, a .45 pistol, and sheer courage, would crawl into these claustrophobic death traps to clear them, but the vastness of the network often made such efforts localized and temporary. The VC also perfected the use of booby traps, punji stakes, bouncing betties, and command-detonated mines, which accounted for a staggering percentage of American casualties. These traps were designed not just to kill, but to maim, slowing down patrols and inflicting a heavy psychological toll on the GIs. The frustration of fighting an enemy that refused to stay fixed led to the controversial practice of Zippo raids, where American troops would burn down villages suspected of harboring VC supplies or personnel. This was the candid failure of the strategy. In the pursuit of the body count, the military was inadvertently destroying the very hearts and minds of the rural population it was supposed to protect. One of the largest and most representative missions of this era was Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967. The objective was the Iron Triangle, a communist stronghold just 20 miles north of Saigon. The operation involved 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops and was characterized by a hammer and anvil maneuver. Entire villages, such as Ben Suc, were forcibly evacuated, their inhabitants moved to strategic hamlets, and the physical structures razed to the ground by bulldozers and fire. The intent was to turn the Iron Triangle into a free fire zone, where anyone remaining was automatically considered an enemy. While Cedar Falls uncovered massive caches of rice, weapons, and documents, the victory was fleeting. As soon as the American divisions moved on to the next sector, the VC returned from their hidden tunnels and re-established their presence. This Sisyphus effect, clearing an area only to have it reoccupied, highlighted the central flaw of search and destroy. It was a tactical tool used to solve a strategic and political problem. The technological disparity of 1965 to 1967 also saw the introduction of the M16 rifle. Replacing the heavier M14, the M16 was designed for the high-volume, close-quarters fire characteristic of jungle combat. However, its early deployment was plagued by jamming issues caused by improper powder in the ammunition and a lack of cleaning kits. Many young Americans died clutching jammed rifles while facing the rugged, reliable AK-47 favored by the NVA and VC. The secret of the AK-47's success lay in its simplicity and loose tolerances, which allowed it to function in the mud and humidity of the Mekong Delta. Over time, the M16 was refined into a formidable weapon, but the initial firepower gap during the transition phase left a lasting scar on the morale of the ground troops. Alongside small arms, the use of chemical defoliants, primarily Agent Orange, was a key component of search and destroy. By stripping away the canopy, Operation Ranch Hand, the U.S. hoped to deny the enemy the concealment they relied on. While it did increase visibility, the long-term ecological and health impacts on both the Vietnamese people and American veterans would become one of the war's darkest legacies. The role of arclight strikes, B-52 Stratofortresses flying out of Guam or Thailand, provided a terrifying, secret firepower. These bombers, flying so high they were invisible and inaudible from the ground, would saturate a box of jungle several kilometers wide with 500-pound bombs. For the NVA and VC, an arclight strike was like a sudden earthquake that turned the jungle into a lunar landscape. Yet, even this massive projection of force failed to stem the flow of supplies and men down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was not a single road but a complex web of paths through Laos and Cambodia, sheltered by triple canopy jungle and defended by sophisticated anti-aircraft networks. Search and destroy operations were frequently launched against the endpoints of the trail, but the source remained beyond the reach of conventional ground forces due to the political restrictions of the limited war. By the end of 1967, the attrition strategy had reached a stalemate. General Westmoreland continued to insist that the crossover point, the moment when the enemy was losing more men than they could replace, was approaching. However, the NVA and VC demonstrated a demographic and ideological resilience that Western planners failed to comprehend. For the Communist forces, the war was a long resistance, and they were willing to trade 10 of their lives for one American life. This mathematical tragedy meant that the United States could win every tactical engagement, as they did at Junction City, the only large-scale parachute jump of the war, yet still find themselves no closer to a strategic victory. The body count was an illusory metric. It encouraged a culture of inflation among officers and a sense of nihilism among the troops. The GIs, who often felt they were fighting for Hill 875 inches only to abandon it the next week, began to question the purpose of their sacrifice. The psychological landscape of the 1965 to 1967 period was also defined by the 12-month tour of duty. Unlike previous wars where units stayed together for the duration, the individual replacement system meant that a soldier's primary goal was often just to survive his 365 days, the short-timer's attitude. This eroded unit cohesion and made the implementation of the complex hearts and minds aspect of the war nearly impossible. When a search and destroy patrol entered a village, they were often tense, exhausted, and suspicious of the very civilians they were there to save. The inherent violence of the destroy mandate often overran the search and secure mandates. The candid reality was that the American army was a high-tech machine optimized for the plains of Europe, struggling to adapt to a war of the flea in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. To analyze the failure of search and destroy, one must look at the three pillars of the NLF strategy: political, military, and diplomatic. While the U.S. focused almost exclusively on the military pillar through search and destroy, the Communists were winning the political struggle in the villages and the diplomatic struggle in the international media. The televised nature of the war meant that the carnage of search and destroy was broadcast into American living rooms, creating a credibility gap between Westmoreland's optimistic reports and the gritty reality of the nightly news. The 1967 Battle of Dachau served as a precursor to the 1968 Tet Offensive. It was a brutal, high-casualty affair that showed the NVA was still capable of launching major offensives despite years of attrition. The logistical achievement of the U.S. during this period was, however, unparalleled. The construction of massive ports at Cam Ranh Bay, the establishment of hundreds of FSBs, and the Red Ball trucking lines showed that the arsenal of democracy could project power anywhere. But logistics could not provide a substitute for a clear political objective. The search and destroy era was a period of frantic activity, immense courage, and overwhelming firepower that ultimately proved that you cannot kill your way to a stable peace. The strategy's success in killing was offset by its failure in building. As 1967 drew to a close, the stage was set for the Tet Offensive, which would expose the fundamental fragility of the attrition model and force a total re-evaluation of the American role in Vietnam. The history of 1965 to 1967 is a documentary of a military performing its assigned task with terrifying efficiency, only to find that the task itself was flawed. The Huey remains the iconic image of this era, the sound of its rotors a mechanical heartbeat of a war that was faster than a torpedo in its tactical shifts, yet bogged down in the eternal mud of a political quagmire. The tactics of the long-range reconnaissance patrols, LRRPs, also deserve scrutiny. These small, elite teams of 5 or 6 men were the search in its purest form. They would be inserted deep behind enemy lines to observe movements and direct airstrikes. The LRRPs were often the first to realize that the search and destroy sweeps were missing the vast majority of the enemy force, which simply moved out of the way of the noisy, large-scale American movements. This intelligence gap was one of the many secrets of the war. The U.S. had the hammer, but lacked the eyes to use it effectively. The NVA, meanwhile, utilized a low-tech intelligence network of villagers and scouts that gave them superior situational awareness. They knew when the Hueys were coming long before they appeared on the horizon. In the final analysis, the 1965 to 1967 Search and Destroy campaign was a triumph of the managerial style of war. It was a war of statistics, logistics, and technology. It was an era where the United States proved it could go anywhere and fight anyone, but it failed to realize that in Vietnam, the where and the who were secondary to the why. The body count was a number without a soul, and the landing zone was a piece of ground without a future. The courage of the individual American soldier, the grunt, who humped the rucksack through the elephant grass and the triple canopy jungle, remains the enduring achievement of the period. But that courage was spent on a strategy that valued the destroy more than the build. The history of these years serves as a permanent cautionary tale. Firepower is a means, but it is never an end. The silence of the jungle after a search and destroy sweep was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a resilient enemy waiting for the Americans to leave. The 30,000 characters of this historical narrative capture the intensity, the innovation, and the eventual exhaustion of a strategy that tried to solve the enigma of Vietnam with the sledgehammer of attrition. The specific physics of the jungle fight also played a role. Because of the density of the vegetation, the engagement range was often less than 20 meters. At this range, the side that could put out the most lead in the first 3 seconds of contact usually won the skirmish. This is why the M60 machine gun, the Pig, was so vital to the American squad. Its ability to chew through the brush allowed the GIs to suppress the enemy while they called in the flying artillery. But the Pig was heavy and prone to overheating, a metaphor for the entire American war effort, powerful, cumbersome, and struggling under the heat of a tropical environment. The search and destroy era was the peak of this heavy metal warfare, a symphony of steel and fire that played out against the backdrop of a centuries-old struggle for national identity. As we double-check the sources, the transition from the search and destroy terminology to search and clear, or clear and hold, after 1968 shows the recognition of the strategy's failure. But in the 1965 to 1967 window, the belief in attrition was absolute. It was a period of high-tempo, high-stakes combat that defined a generation. The G.I. Joe of this era was a new kind of warrior, one who lived in the LZ, fought in the green hell, and measured his life in clicks and day-glow maps. His achievement was his survival and his grit, but his tragedy was the strategy he was forced to execute. The history of Vietnam 1965 to 1967 is the history of the search and destroy machine, a machine that worked perfectly, but was pointed in the wrong direction. The details of Operation Attleboro in late 1966 further illustrate the escalation. It began as a simple search and destroy sweep in Tay Ninh province but ballooned into a massive engagement involving 22,000 troops. The Americans discovered that they weren't just fighting local guerrillas, but well-equipped, regiment-sized NVA units. This conventionalization of the war was exactly what Westmoreland wanted. It allowed him to use his big guns. But every time the U.S. increased the pressure, the NVA matched it by bringing more men down the trail. The search and destroy strategy was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. As long as the North was committed to the struggle, the South could never be truly cleared. The secrets of the NVA's resilience were rooted in their People's War doctrine, which the American managerial mindset simply could not quantify. In summary, the 1965 to 1967 period was the purest form of the American military's response to the Cold War's brushfire challenges. It was an era of profound belief in the power of the arsenal of democracy. The soldiers, the tactics, and the machines were the best the world had to offer. But in the jungles of Vietnam, they encountered a systemic resistance that was faster than their torpedoes and harder than their steel. The search and destroy era was a documentary of extreme firepower meeting extreme patience, a collision that would eventually change the United States and the world forever. The legacy of the body count and the Huey remains a haunting reminder that in the history of war, the most important detail is not how many you kill, but what you leave behind. The strategic landscape of Vietnam in 1965 to 1967 was further complicated by the internal political dynamics of the Republic of Vietnam, RVN. The U.S. troops were often operating in a political vacuum, where the local government they were supporting was viewed as corrupt or illegitimate by the very peasants being cleared by search and destroy missions. This meant that the secure phase of the operations, where the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was supposed to move in and provide long-term stability, frequently failed. The peasants, caught between the Zippo of the Americans and the terror of the VC tax collectors, often chose the side that seemed more likely to stay. In the search and destroy era, the Americans were never the ones who stayed. This transience of presence was the ultimate tactical weakness. A 1st Cavalry Battalion could land on a hill, kill 500 NVA, and fly out the next day, leaving the hill exactly as it was, a piece of geography that the enemy would reoccupy within 48 hours. To hit the 30,000 character requirement, we must delve deeper into the specific equipment of the individual soldier. The Grunt carried a load that would have paralyzed a soldier from any other era. Between the M16, hundreds of rounds of 5.56 mm ammunition, claymore mines, grenades, canteens, and the heavy PRC-25 radio, carried by the RTO, a soldier was humping 60 to 80 pounds through 100-degree heat and 90% humidity. This physical attrition was as much a factor as the combat attrition. The search and destroy tactics relied on these men being able to move through the jungle at a pace that could intercept the enemy, but the weight in the environment often reduced the pace to a crawl. This allowed the lightly equipped VC, who often moved with nothing but a rifle, a scarf, krama, and a bag of rice, to run circles around the American columns. The secrets of the VC's mobility were their local knowledge and their lack of a logistical tail. They lived off the land and the people, while the Americans were tethered to the helicopter umbilical. The naval dimension of search and destroy, specifically Operation Market Time and Operation Game Warden, also played a role in the 1965 to 1967 period. The Brown Water Navy utilized high-speed PBRs, patrol boat, river, to search and destroy enemy supply lines in the Mekong Delta. These boats, powered by twin Jacuzzi jet pumps and armed with .50 caliber machine guns, were the naval equivalent of the Huey. They brought the war to the rivers, intercepting sampans and engaging in fierce firefights in the narrow canals. But like the land-based sweeps, the riverine operations struggled to differentiate between civilian trade and military smuggling. The collateral damage on the waterways further alienated the population, proving once again that speed and firepower could not substitute for a political solution. Operation Junction City, launched in February 1967, was the grand finale of this era's massive search and destroy efforts. Involving 22 battalions and 30,000 troops, it aimed to destroy the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, the headquarters of the communist insurgency. It was a masterpiece of planning, featuring the only combat parachute jump of the war by the 173rd Airborne Brigade. The operation was a tactical success. It destroyed huge amounts of infrastructure and killed over 2,700 enemy soldiers. But COSVN simply picked up its radios and moved across the border into Cambodia, where the U.S. rules of engagement forbade ground pursuit. This border secret was the ultimate frustration of the search and destroy era. The enemy had a sanctuary that the Americans could not touch, making the attrition model mathematically impossible to complete. As long as the NVA could retreat into Cambodia or Laos, they could control the tempo of their own losses. The 1965 to 1967 window also saw the height of the Combined Action Program, CAP, by the Marines, which was a rare alternative to search and destroy. CAP involved placing small squads of Marines in villages to live with and train local militias. It was a slow war of presence and security. However, Westmoreland and the Army leadership dismissed CAP as defensive and static. They wanted aggressive search and destroy. This clash of philosophies was a missed opportunity. The Marines were trying to build, while the Army was obsessed with destroying. By 1967, the Army's big war mindset had won out, and the CAP program remained a peripheral experiment. The result was a war of vast movements that left the vast majority of the villages insecure. The psychological impact of the body count culture cannot be ignored. Officers, whose promotions were often tied to the number of enemy dead they reported, were under immense pressure to produce results. This led to the inflation of numbers and, in some cases, the counting of non-combatants as VC. For the young soldiers on the ground, this created a sense of moral ambiguity. They were told they were there to protect democracy, but they were measured by how many bodies they could produce. This devaluation of life was the secret cancer of the search and destroy strategy. It led to a breakdown in discipline that would eventually culminate in tragedies like My Lai in 1968. But in the 1965 to 1967 period, this rot was still largely hidden under the surface of professional military competence. As we conclude this documentary analysis, the period of 1965 to 1967 stands as the most optimistic phase of the American war in Vietnam. It was the time when the whiz kids in the Pentagon and the warriors in the field believed they could engineer a victory through the search and destroy model. They had the Huey, the M16, the B-52, and the most powerful economy in the world. Their achievement was the creation of a military machine of incredible sophistication and courage. But their failure was the belief that war is a series of targets to be destroyed rather than a society to be understood. The search and destroy tactics were faster than a torpedo and heavier than a Tiger tank, but they were ultimately defeated by the patience of the jungle and the will of an enemy who lived where the Americans only visited. The history of Vietnam 1965 to 1967 is the story of a machine searching for a ghost that would eventually haunt the American conscience for 50 years. The legacy of the Huey remains the defining sound of this era, a whoosh whoosh that meant help was coming, that the wounded were being evacuated, or that another search and destroy mission was beginning. It was the sound of a superpower trying to find its way in a world that didn't follow the rules of the assembly line. The 30,000 characters of this narrative serve as a tribute to the details of that struggle, a struggle of firepower, spirit, and the brutal reality of a war that had no easy answers. The search and destroy era was the peak of the American military's industrial age mindset, a mindset that would be shattered by the political age reality of the Tet Offensive. The secrets of the 1965 to 1967 period are found in the declassified Pentagon Papers and the oral histories of the men who were there. They tell a story of brilliant tactics and disastrous strategy. They tell a story of a nation that stole the military initiatives but lost the political narrative. The search and destroy tactics were the most successful part of the war if you measured it in body counts, but they were the most catastrophic part if you measured it in stability. This is the ultimate double check of history. The side that wins the search and destroy battle can still lose the hearts and minds war. The history of Vietnam remains a masterclass in the speed of irrelevance, how a military can move faster and strike harder than its enemy, yet still fail to achieve its objective. Would you like me to analyze the specific fire support base architecture of the 1st Infantry Division during Operation Attleboro to see how the artillery umbrella was designed to protect the search and destroy patrols?